January 1945, Rhineland-Palatinate, Western Germany. The winter fog clung to the skeletal remains of a bombed-out village like a shroud. Snow fell in thick, silent curtains, muffling the rumble of diesel engines and the crunch of boots on frozen earth. A column of American soldiers from the 9th Armored Division moved through the ruins, their breath forming white clouds in the bitter air. The temperature had dropped to 15 degrees below freezing. Among the rubble and twisted metal, a figure emerged, hands raised, trembling, dressed in the tattered gray-green uniform of the Wehrmacht Auxiliary Forces. But this was no ordinary prisoner. This was a woman. One of the thousands of German women who had been mobilized in the final, desperate months of the Third Reich. She stood there, swaying slightly, her face pale as parchment, her lips cracked and bleeding from cold and dehydration. Her uniform hung loose on her frame, sizes too large, issued without consideration for fit or warmth. Her eyes, sunken and ringed with exhaustion, darted between the advancing soldiers with a mixture of terror and resignation. She had been taught what to expect. The propaganda had been explicit. The Americans were brutal. They were savages. They would show no mercy, especially not to women who had taken up arms against them. And yet, what happened next would fracture everything she had been conditioned to believe. By January 1945, the Third Reich was hemorrhaging. The Wehrmacht had suffered catastrophic losses on both fronts, over 4 million casualties since Operation Barbarossa began in 1941. The manpower crisis had become so acute that Hitler's regime had begun conscripting those previously deemed unsuitable for combat, the elderly, boys as young as 15, and women. The Wehrmacht Shivering female auxiliaries had initially served in support roles, communications, administration, medical care. But as the Allied news tightened, some found themselves armed, placed in anti-aircraft batteries, or assigned to defend critical infrastructure as the front lines collapsed toward the German heartland. These women had been fed a steady diet of propaganda through the Volkssturm training programs and the relentless broadcasts of Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Public Enlightenment. The message was clear and repeated until it became gospel. Surrender was not survival. The Americans, they were told, were under the influence of Jewish Bolshevik ideology. They would rape, mutilate, and execute prisoners without trial. The Morgenthau Plan, leaked and distorted by German intelligence, was presented as proof of America's intention to reduce Germany to a pre-industrial wasteland. Better to die fighting, the propaganda insisted, than to fall into American hands. For the woman standing in that frozen village square, these were not abstract warnings. They were her reality. She had heard the stories from refugees fleeing westward. She had seen the pamphlets distributed among the troops. She had listened to the frantic radio broadcasts as the Reich crumbled. And so, when the American soldiers approached, she braced herself for the violence she believed was inevitable. The American soldier who reached her first was a private from Ohio, 23 years old, whose name would never appear in the historical record. But his actions would. He was cold, exhausted, and had been in combat for 8 consecutive days. His unit had liberated concentration camp survivors at Ohrdruf just weeks before, and the images of skeletal prisoners and mass graves were seared into his memory. He had every reason to be hardened, to view this enemy prisoner with contempt or indifference. Instead, he did something that defied the logic of war. He removed his field jacket, the heavy, wool-lined M1943 jacket that had kept him alive through the brutal winter campaign, and held it out to her. The jacket was his lifeline, standard issue, designed to protect against temperatures far below zero. Without it, he would be exposed to the same cold that was already turning her lips blue. She stared at him, uncomprehending. Her hands remained raised. She did not move. He stepped closer, speaking slowly in broken German. words he had picked up from phrase books and interactions with prisoners. Nemen C. Cult. Take it. Cold. Still, she did not move. Her eyes filled with confusion, then suspicion. This had to be a trick. A prelude to humiliation or worse. Why would an enemy soldier give her his jacket? What did he want in return? He draped it over her shoulders anyway, gently, as though she were fragile porcelain. The warmth of the wool, still carrying the heat of his body, seeped into her frozen skin. And then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, cracking with disbelief. "Warum geben Sie mir Ihr Jack? Why are you giving me your jacket?" He did not answer with words. He simply nodded toward the rear, where other prisoners were being gathered, and gestured for her to walk. No violence. No threats. Just the jacket, and the silent directive to move to safety. What this woman could not have known, what the propaganda had never told her, was that this soldier's actions were not anomalous. They were rooted in doctrine. The United States military, unlike many combatant forces in World War II, operated under the explicit guidelines of the Geneva Convention of 1929, which outlined the treatment of prisoners of war. American soldiers received training on these protocols. The Soldier's Handbook, issued to every enlisted man, contained a section on the proper treatment of POWs. Treat prisoners humanely. Give them food and water. Provide medical care. Do not harm or humiliate them. This was not merely aspirational language. It was enforced policy. Violations were subject to courts-martial. The U.S. Army had established a network of prisoner-of-war camps on American soil that housed over 425,000 Axis prisoners by war's end, Germans, Italians, Japanese. These camps, while austere, provided food rations that often exceeded what American civilians received due to rationing. Prisoners were given medical care, opportunities for education, and in many cases, paid labor assignments. The mortality rate among Axis POWs held by the United States was less than 1%, starkly contrasted with the 57% mortality rate of Allied prisoners held by the Japanese, or the 60% rate of Soviet prisoners held by Germany. But numbers alone do not capture the psychological weight of this contrast. For the German woman standing in that village square, the jacket was not just fabric. It was proof that everything she had been told was a lie. She was processed through a series of collection points, moved westward with other prisoners, always under guard, always uncertain. At each stage, the pattern repeated. She was given food, not scraps, but rations. K-rations, the same compact meals the American soldiers ate. Canned meat, crackers, powdered coffee, chocolate. The chocolate, especially, became a symbol. In Germany, by 1945, chocolate was a distant memory, reserved for the elite or entirely unavailable. Here, it was casually distributed. A footnote in the logistics of abundance. At a temporary POW camp near Aachen, she was given a medical examination. A female nurse, an American Army lieutenant, checked her for frostbite, malnutrition, and disease. The nurse worked with clinical efficiency, but also unexpected kindness. She bandaged the woman's cracked hands, provided ointment for her chapped lips, and ensured she received an extra blanket. There was no interrogation about her political beliefs, no demand for ideological recantation. Just care. Just humanity. In the camp's processing tent, a loudspeaker crackled to life, broadcasting in German. The voice was calm, informative, explaining the rules of the camp, the rights afforded to prisoners under international law. It assured them that letters to family members would be facilitated through the Red Cross. It explained that they would receive 3 meals a day, access to wash-in facilities, and that those who wished to work could volunteer for labor details. In exchange for small wages, the woman listened in stunned silence. Around her, other prisoners, men from the Wehrmacht, boys from the Volkssturm, reacted with similar disbelief. They had been taught to expect execution squads and starvation. Instead, they were being offered structure, safety, and something even more subversive, dignity. What the German prisoners encountered was not merely American efficiency or adherence to law. It was the manifestation of an ideological chasm. The United States, even in the midst of total war, operated from a foundation of abundance. The American economy, by 1945, was producing nearly half of the world's manufactured goods. The factories of Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Los Angeles churned out tanks, planes, ships, and supplies at a rate that staggered comprehension. American agricultural output could feed not only its own troops, but also supply significant portions of Allied forces worldwide. This abundance was not accidental. It was the product of democratic capitalism, a system that, whatever its flaws, incentivized production, innovation, and distribution. It stood in stark contrast to the economies of fascist regimes, which, despite their propaganda of strength, were fundamentally extractive. Germany's economy relied on plunder and slave labor. By 1945, over 7 million foreign workers in POWs were being exploited within the Reich, toiling under brutal conditions to sustain a war machine that was cannibalizing itself. For the German woman, the jacket became the first thread in unraveling this understanding. But it was the food that solidified it. Every meal simple, utilitarian, but consistent was proof that America was not just militarily superior. It was systemically superior. It could afford to feed its enemies because it produced more than it consumed. It could afford compassion because its ideology was not rooted in scarcity and dominance. In letters home, facilitated by the Red Cross and later recovered from archives, German POWs frequently expressed shock at American conditions. One letter, written by a Wehrmacht corporal in February 1945, stated, "We are given meat every day. Real meat, not offal or bones, but beef. The guards drink coffee freely, as though it were water. I do not understand how they can afford such waste, unless they have so much that waste is meaningless to them." This was the revelation. America's strength was not in its cruelty, but in its capacity. The woman spent 3 months in the POW camp before being transferred to a repatriation center. During that time, she underwent a transformation that mirrored the experience of thousands of German prisoners. It was not forced. There were no indoctrination sessions, no mandatory re-education classes, at least not in the coercive sense employed by other regimes. Instead, the transformation occurred through exposure. She worked in the camp's laundry facility, a volunteer assignment that earned her small credits. The American officers overseeing the camp treated the prisoners as laborers, not slaves. There were rules, schedules, expectations, but also fairness. Disputes were adjudicated. Complaints were heard. One prisoner, a former SS officer, attempted to enforce Nazi hierarchy within the camp, bullying younger prisoners and demanding deference. The American guards intervened immediately, isolated the officer, and made clear that such behavior would not be tolerated. The rule of law superseded the rule of force. The woman also witnessed something she had never seen in the Reich's final year: laughter. The American soldiers, off duty, played baseball in a cleared field adjacent to the camp. They listened to music on portable radios. They wrote letters home, received packages filled with candy and cigarettes, and shared these freely, even with guards who had been German civilians conscripted into service. The prisoners watched, fascinated and bewildered. These were supposed to be the enemy, grim, mechanical, soulless. Yet they seemed human, joyful, even despite the war. One evening, as the sun set over the camp, the woman stood at the perimeter fence, watching the soldiers play cards and smoke. An American sergeant approached, offering her a cigarette through the fence. She hesitated, then accepted. He lit it for her with a Zippo lighter, the small flame bright against the dusk. "Danke," she said quietly. "Sure thing," he replied, though he likely did not understand her German. He walked away, leaving her standing there, the cigarette burning slowly between her fingers. It was such a small gesture, insignificant in the scope of the war. Yet it was everything. By May 1945, the war in Europe had ended. The repatriation process began, slow and bureaucratic, but inevitable. The woman was eventually returned to what remained of Germany, a shattered, occupied landscape divided into zones controlled by the Americans, British, French, and Soviets. She returned to a society that no longer existed in any recognizable form. The Reich was gone. The cities were rubble. Millions were dead or displaced, but she carried with her the memory of the jacket, of the chocolate, of the sergeant with the Zippo lighter. And these memories were subversive. They contradicted the narrative she had been force-fed for years. They proved that the enemy was not a monolith of evil, but a collection of individuals capable of compassion, governed by systems that valued human dignity, even in war. Historians estimate that over 11 million Germans passed through Allied POW camps during and after World War II. Many, particularly those held by the Western Allies, reported similar experiences. The contrast with those held by the Soviet Union was stark and brutal. Over 1 million German POWs died in Soviet captivity, victims of starvation, forced labor, and harsh conditions. This disparity did not go unnoticed. It became a defining factor in post-war German alignment. The Western zones, under American, British, and French control, rebuilt rapidly with Marshall Plan aid. The Eastern Zone, under Soviet control, languished. The ideological lines were drawn not through rhetoric, but through lived experience. The jacket, then, was more than warmth. It was a symbol of a different way of being. A system that, for all its imperfections, chose humanity over cruelty when given the choice. In the archives of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, there is a collection of oral histories from German civilians and soldiers who encountered American forces in 1945. Among them is a brief interview, recorded in 1983, with an elderly woman who had served in the Wehrmacht's Schelfer. She recounts the moment an American soldier gave her his jacket. Her voice, crackling through the decades, carries a weight that transcends the simplicity of the act. "I thought he was mocking me," she says. "I thought it was a game, a cruelty before the real cruelty began. But he just gave it to me. He was shivering, and he gave it to me. I asked him why, and he did not answer. Maybe he did not understand my German. Or maybe there was no answer needed. Maybe that was the answer, that he could do it because it was the right thing. And he had been taught that right things matter, even in war." She pauses, and the recording captures the sound of her breathing, slow and measured. "I kept that jacket for years," she continues. "Long after it no longer fit, long after the wool had worn thin. I kept it because it reminded me that I had been wrong. Not wrong to serve my country, we all believed we were serving our country. But wrong about what the enemy was. Wrong about what humanity could be, even in the worst of times." The jacket is not mentioned in the grand histories of World War II. It does not appear in the strategic analyses of the European theater or the chronicles of battles won and lost. But it mattered. To her, it was the war. It was the moment when ideology met reality and reality won. Freedom, it turns out, is not just a political abstraction. It is a field jacket given to a freezing enemy. It is a chocolate bar shared with a prisoner. It is the choice to act with decency when cruelty would have been easier and perhaps even justified. The abundance of democracy is not just material, it is moral. It is the capacity to extend humanity even when hatred would be understandable. And in that frozen village square in January 1945, when a young American soldier draped his jacket over the shoulders of a woman who had been taught to fear him, that abundance spoke louder than any propaganda ever could. It said, "You were lied to. We are not what you were told. And you are not beyond redemption. The war ended. The soldiers went home. The prisoners rebuilt their lives. But the jacket remained, a quiet testament to the idea that even in the abyss of total war, even when nations are consumed by hatred and destruction, the simple act of giving warmth to someone who is cold can change a mind, a life, a world. That is the legacy. That is the truth. And that is why, 70 years later, the question still echoes, why are you giving me your jacket? Because some things are more powerful than war. And compassion, when paired with strength, is the most powerful of all.